Old order has collapsed, and then the Soros comes as the new sheriff in town.
They are closed calls for how you funnel your practice into a political desire.
It had something to do, it had a political agenda.
A is the identity, B is new media technology, so how do we internationalize it through technology, and C is Soros realist product.
Is this Bruce Lee, for example, is this an example of what you call social engineering?
It's not art. It's all propaganda. The art world is a monopoly of ideology.
Dobar dan, ja sam Ljiljiana Smajlović, a danas razgovaram sa Aaronom Moultonom. Aaron je kustos, pisac i samouki antropolog, kako on to kaže. Specijalnost mu je savremena umetnost Istočne Evrope. U stvari, savremena umetnost koju je finansirala, podsticala, na neki način proizvodila Sorosova fondacija za otvoreno društvo 90. godina prošlog veka. I on u posljednje vreme izučava tu stvar već 15 godina. On tu sada ne zove toliko umetnošću koliko socijalnim inženjeringom. A danas iznimno razgovaramo na engleskom jeziku. Aaron, thank you for being here. And thank you for shedding light on Eastern European cultural projects in the 90s, because we really need outside voices like yours here. People who would venture to make the arguments similar to the arguments you're making either get dismissed or attacked as nationalists, sometimes fascists. That's what you get for criticizing Western narratives in one part of Serbian society, but it's an important elite part of Serbian society. It will be less easy to dismiss you because you're American. You're not funded by right-wing organizations, so you cannot be dismissed as a fascist. You are a Western liberal who takes liberal values seriously and uses them to criticize some things that came from the West. So I am fully aware that you're not a Soros basher, and we're not going to beat up here on either Soros or his son. But I have to ask you, still, how dare you critique globalism or elites in the context of George Soros? Isn't that the kind of thing that gets people in trouble even in America these days? Don't people say this is anti-Semitic? These are, what's the word, tropes, anti-Semitic tropes, when you start criticizing something that Soros does?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really great way to come into this story, because it kind of reflects the conspiracy of silence around it. This is a story, the story I'm telling through this research is bizarrely unknown in America. Almost no one in the Western world, even once you get into Western Europe, is aware that George Soros is probably the greatest philanthropist that the contemporary art world, and that the path of globalization in the contemporary art world has ever seen. And when we think of the great karmic and vanity values of being a great philanthropist in the Western art world, I mean, it's you want your name all over that stuff. And for some reason, we're not aware that George Soros set up 20 centers for contemporary art all at the same time, all through Eastern Europe, and brought some of the most advanced practices that we've ever seen in the history of the industry. It's a glaring absence in our historical record. And I would argue that it's not just like a reference point for the globalization of the art world, but it's a cornerstone. And is it dangerous to talk about it? Yeah, isn't that fascinating? I find the media is very culpable in this conspiracy of silence to create what I like to refer to as spells, magical spells, to kind of prevent us from seeing things. And anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic call-out, conspiracy theory call-out, well, these are things that actually short-circuit your audience almost in an instant. You just have to use those words like look at any byline of George Soros, when they're introducing him in any article, the first 10 words say, victim of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, fantasy boogeyman of the right wing, blah, blah, blah. So in the mere instant of entering George Soros, we are we're almost weaponized around the concept of George Soros. And of course, I don't think he's a boogeyman. Whoa, you know what? I'm not a part of that. You know, your audience is forced into this pick a side narrative, in like a borderline. It's not subliminal. It's overt. And I think that the fact that he's Jewish is actually a diversionary tactic to prevent understanding of his work. Like, let's just talk about the work. My show has nothing to do with, or my research has nothing to do with the fact that he's Jewish or anti-Jewish ideas. You know, it's just, but there is something strange that happens when you approach this subject. And I appreciate that mystical quality that it has, because it's like we're giving it a lot of dark energy in a very strange way. And I want to do a cleanse.
But you know, it's not just Soros. When you, in my country, even criticizing NGOs gets you in trouble.
Yeah.
Now, it gets local people in trouble because, and if they're artists, the question is, who's going to fund you?
Yeah.
How are you going to get funded? Does that mean that you've chosen the other side, that you're going to be nice to the government? Because if you're not nice to the NGOs and you want to declare yourself critical of the government, you're in trouble. You don't have any funders. Is it like that in other Eastern European countries?
Yeah, I mean, but this is also the really interesting thing about this story is that it reflects larger symptoms of how this has become a globalized phenomenon. People's voices are, you know, the artist today is very much expected to be an activist. Socially engaged practice is the primary form of communication in the contemporary art world, and that is your ability as an artist to weaponize your work in the form of activism. And it would be a really amazing thing if there was a spectrum to that activism, but there's not. It's a very fixed terrain that people are pulling from. It's very specific politics and political agendas that reflect neoliberalism, liberalism, or leftist values. And you know, these are all interesting, but there is a problem that we're not allowing a total, I think there's two problems. The forcing of an artist to be political, I think, is a big problem, and then that the politics have to be specific.
Well, let's talk about that, the forcing of an artist to be political. Why? I said that I'm very glad you're in Belgrade. And you're in Belgrade because you had an exhibition and you talked about your research, and you talked about your research in the presence of artists and people who are engaged in NGOs, and you talked to exactly the people who carried out some of these programs that you now say have been major social engineering projects in retrospect, right? So how was that? How did your debate, your engagement with this art world scene in Belgrade, how did that go? How did they receive your arguments?
Well, you know, and there's a little bit more to how I frame this story, because I definitely am one of the world's experts in this subject and in the history of the network, but my real practice lies in anthropology and in spiritual anthropology, and I have embedded myself with all kinds of different groups, New Age groups, witch communities, and the right wing. In the case of this exhibition, it's all about understanding tribal dynamics, their invention of sacred traditions, and how they manifest and materialize creativity into objects, and what the purposing and directionalizing of that looks like. And the thing that I do that's actually incredibly uncomfortable, but does put a proper mirror up to what this actually represents, is I look at it like a New Age cult, a New Age cult for social engineering. And that is weaponizing politics in a spiritual way, that is now making almost everybody in a kind of a crazy state of reflex or political, we're constantly forced into these pick a side narratives. These are, again, tricks to actually short circuit your viewer's ability to choose when you force people to pick a side. And it always is forcing us into we're always getting these narratives ever simplified, like anti-vaxxing is right wing, is the non-support of the war for Ukraine is, there's a mathematics that's actually happening, which is constantly simplifying how we are funneled into good or evil camps. And so, yeah.
But even when we simplify, you would call yourself a man of the left, I would assume.
No, I'm not.
Not
anything.
even. Nothing.
I have no hidden political agenda in the work I've done. I've not done this as a way to provide a solution. That's one of the things I get confronted by through NGOs is what solution are you proposing? And I'm like, well, I'm not an NGO. I'm not. I don't have a think tank of resources to come up with a social engineering solution. Actually, I think mind your own business. That's the strategy I would offer to the NGOs. But the real problem is people need to believe I have a political agenda. They need to believe I have a political intention deep somewhere behind these actions. But the real intention...
But you certainly don't have a right-wing agenda.
Zero.
We can agree on that. Okay.
But that doesn't change the fact that people believe I'm doing this for the purposes of helping a right-wing agenda. But this is chaos. This is an actual effort to create a destabilization in political consciousness. It's an intervention into political consciousness to create a very necessary chaos that somebody else can pick up the pieces with and figure out a solution. But what we need is a wake-up call. The way that politics has taken over people's minds like a religion is very problematic. It's spiritualized people in a very toxic way. And this is somehow a part of that.
So what were the arguments? You call this cluster of Soros centers, art centers, the centers that in Eastern Europe that funded artists. You call them the influence machine. What were the counter arguments that you were presented with in Belgrade? Did people tell you, "Oh, give us a break. Every artist is political. All art is political." And what was the argument, and how did you engage with it?
So it's the macro view. The incredible thing about this whole story is the amount of data that comes from it, and it's just a wealth of case studies of each. There's 20 of these centers. They each had different success-fail rates and how they did what they did. They each had different ways in which they did what they did. But there's an incredible thing that happens in the early founding of this from 1993 to 95, where there's the people that are running the center in Prague or in Moldova or in Chisinau, they don't know what it means to run a center for contemporary art. They don't know what it means to be a curator. They don't know exactly what they're doing. They've been handpicked to become the most asymmetrically powerful person their art world has ever seen.
Well, let's just put that into context, because I like the way you described it. You said there's transition, the old order has collapsed, and then the Soros comes as the new sheriff in town. And these centers are ready to spend 10 times as much money as each of these individual states is spending in the field. Yeah. And that is incredibly powerful. And you're saying these are people who did not come with preordained ideas what they're going to do, the curators. But how did it all turn out to be very similar?
It means they had to kind of like do the Macarena together and like follow an idea that was given to them from Budapest and from New York. They were all given a procedures manual that helped institutionalize practice in a very experimental way across a very new, emergent institutional phenomenon. It made them in lockstep operate in the same way. But when you read the procedures manual, which is not a well-archived document, it's very hard to find a copy. I have a pirated copy. It's not like it's like, and we're going to control artists. But there is a lot of language that helps create control. It's the mechanics of control are there writ large. And so how do you write an open call for an annual exhibition? And how do you, what are the appropriate ways the moral compass goes for things. And so what I think is the really fascinating moment of data and emergent behavior is in 93 to 95, a very strange simultaneity of practice emerges from each of these places in a way that does not make sense. If we have to think, if we believe, in the West, we want to believe that art, the creative act, is organic and has all these innovative moments that we can map. Like talking about the history of pop art is an obvious case study that's always given to us every 5 years at every institution, and we see the way where the stone hits the water, the point zero. Oh, it's this exhibition in Paris, the Nouveau Realist in 1959, and then something happens in 1960, 61, and then there's this show that the Guggenheim does, and then MoMA does, and then the mushroom effect happens, where we see the viral takeoff of pop art. But that took place over years, where an idea that was a fascinating, innovative, avant-garde phenomena occurs in Paris, travels across the water, we're allowed some consideration what it means for our communication technology of contemporary art, and it starts to infect other artist practices. It's still a very long process. Years it takes for ideas to pass in the analog art world, and we're still talking in the 90s, the analog art world. And it's impossible, the rate of acquisition and adaptation that this thing takes on in terms of how it, in a very viral way, emerges simultaneously from these different places in informally closed societies. It's like that, even that, it's in the West, that would already be a weird thing if you saw it, but in the formerly closed societies, it's like impossible that this kind of communication would happen, that we would adapt to each other's ideas, because they didn't adapt to each other's ideas. They had a plan and they enacted it. They turned the machine on.
The plan was not apparent to everyone at the outset, right? And George Soros is not a person who, he may have been the greatest, the most largesse, the greatest art philanthropist in the world, but he didn't set out to, he didn't say, boy, this is the kind of art I like and I want you to pay for that. It had something to do, it had a political agenda. Mm-hmm. How is that done? How do you tell your artists what you want them to do?
Yeah, George Soros is notoriously oblivious when it comes to talking about the network. He doesn't give any good reasons of why they supported contemporary art in the way they did. And when you look at I always look at Open Society not as a simple NGO, but like a meta NGO, a pyramid of NGOs functioning in all these different aspects of society in terms of how they're doing social engineering and education and healthcare, and contemporary art's just one of them, right? It's a little weird blip actually on the activities of what the Open Society is doing. But I would argue it's the most experimental and radical, and what you actually get to see in it are metaphors of the entire NGO practice. So you see this very unique and artificially advanced, what we call socially engaged practice, emerge out of the network, and the practices literally reflect the interests of the NGO. Like we're gonna actually get an artist to drop their ego, drop their paintbrush in the isolation of the studio, and send them out into the world, to peripheral zones, to Roma tribes, to insane asylums, to places that artists were not thinking to go to, and asking them to make artworks that embraced social consciousness as a medium. And so that sounds okay and like a good thing, but there is something that is a strange detail to how that happens. To argue that these artists were victims or influenced or taken advantage of, that's very hard language, and I think that's a way to help undermine my argument. The reality of artists is they should do whatever they need to do to butter their bread. There's this new opportunity that might get me into the West in a big way. I'm going to take it. I'll do whatever. Fine, no problem. It's the way that happens, though, that we can see somehow that these activist intentions within the work that's coming out of the network are not native to the artist's thinking process. that's where it becomes an interesting thing. This is an NGO phenomenon. It's not an artistic phenomenon. And it's actually, in that way, it's not art.
Would Eddie Rama, for example, be one of the more famous artists cum politicians from that era?
Well, there's, there were plans to set up a Soros Center in Tirana that didn't materialize, but that's not to say that the Open Society has not had an incredible impact on the region, culturally, politically, etc. The interesting thing about this story is for lack of a better word, the cabal of curators. This network is made up of elite representatives now of their cultural communities who have an incredible amount of power, and I would say about half of them go into obscurity. When the network, they start defunding the network in 97, 98, and by 2001, there's it's what's called the sunset years, and by 2001, all of the network facilities, they've either become autonomous and independent, and they've changed their name to the Latvian Center of Contemporary Art versus the Soros Center for Contemporary Art, or they've disappeared into obscurity. And yet and then there's these people, these ambassadors of these things that are an incredibly powerful group of curators, and some of them go up the food chain quite high in their future careers. So Sergio Helme was running the Soros Center in Tallinn, and now she runs the Museum Kumu in Tallinn. And a lesser known fact is that her husband and her son represent the extreme right-wing parties of Estonia, which is a kind of a weird contradiction. But then you have many others. Marta Kutsma is the great example, though. She was Dean of Arts at Yale up until recently, which is she was heading the center in Kiev. Mm-hmm. And then Maria Hlavajova, who ran the center in Bratislava, she runs an institution called BAK, which is the Center for Art and Activism in Holland, and somewhere in Holland, I can't remember. And but that's like literally a next level artist as activism think tank.
I've seen somewhere you're making a reference to that bronze statue of Bruce Lee in Mostar,
Yeah.
in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I know that it was set up in 2005, that it was vandalized immediately, that it was kind of refurbished in 2013. I don't know if it's still up, but does it have anything to do with the Soros art centers?
Very much. There is a phenomena of what we can call turbo sculpture. Mm-hmm. Turbo sculpture is a really native, interesting, emergent phenomena to Eastern Europe. And it's the strange transitioning of how we think of icons in public space, historical statues and monuments, and how can we shift them into lesser political terrains. And it's turning into like big statues of Mickey Mouse or Michael Jackson or Bob Marley or Bruce Lee. So it's shifting the aspirations, the spiritual aspirations of whatever a monument represents into a neoliberal Hollywood fantasy.
So you're telling me this didn't come out of nowhere. This is not just provincial admiration of something that's outside our culture. This is happening all over?
Yeah, there's a whole study around it. And the Bruce Lee of Mostar is arguably the most interesting of the whole thing, because it's a great case study. I don't think it's an artwork at all. Mm-hmm. Rarely is the artist's name who made it cited, because he was merely commissioned to make a thing. Mm-hmm. And he was commissioned by the Soros Center for Contemporary Art in Sarajevo, mm-hmm. who did a think tank-like initiative to help find a creative solution to these sectarian communities and the divides they have about believing in a future through monuments.
Okay, wait, so Bruce Lee was like the answer to the political polarization between Muslims and Croats in Mostar?
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
It's fascinating because there was also prior to this a lot of communication.
Let's find something we agree on.
Let's find something we agree on.
And it's Bruce Lee?
And so, they go around and are talking about, nobody likes what the Croats suggest, nobody likes what the Serbs suggest, nobody likes what the Bosnians suggest. How about Bruce Lee? I can get down with Bruce Lee. Yeah, cool. And but even Bruce Lee was a problem. There's this moment,
Right.
like you just said, almost within days of it being erected, is vandalized because people saw energy in his fight stance, and that the fight stance was pointed towards a neighborhood, and
A
and
specific
people,
neighborhood,
yeah,
yes.
and the fight stance became the problem that led to vandalizing of the sculpture, and but it's got so many fascinating qualities to it in terms of it being a problem-solving exercise of how art can heal society.
I saw you using the term turning your back on your culture or, the local culture. Is that also something that was important in the open calls? You described a funny moment when there's an open call for art in Budapest in 1993, and the open call already says what the artist should look into, but then when the work comes in, the curator says, I'm a little disappointed that we don't have enough war in Bosnia, that we don't have enough of the Roma community that Soros is very committed to. And what about the Budapest homosexuals?
Yeah,
And that was all in a serious tone.
yeah.
That's like you guys didn't grasp what we like.
Like you're not sock puppeting our message enough, is literally what it's saying, you know.
So now I'm going to make it more clear to you what it is that we want.
And it's interesting because that open call is the most amazing. We have to look at that one in particular. That's for an exhibition called Polyphony. We have to look at that as a template. That is the most radical, radically powerful, superpowering of artists in this idea of what they wanted the SCCA to do. It was all, starting, the template starts in Budapest with Susie Masoli. She's the executive director. She's the one who's telling all the partner institutions through the network what to do in a way that's like, her, I'm going to show you how to do the Macarena. And, um, and so the, um, and so that open call is fascinating because it's so articulate as a manifesto of like, we want you to do this stuff. You can do other stuff, but we really want you to do this stuff. And then to talk about how that then becomes the manifestation of influence. Open calls are considered to be this democratic. It's a hallmark of democracy to do an open call to everyone, and allow the entire community can apply. But there's a thing that happens when you have provided such strict instructions in your open call. Well, that's literally a moment of inception that you're forcing the artist in that exact moment to change the way they think about their own creativity to service an ideology that they're forcing. And then what happens with the open calls, which is really fascinating, is open calls become the proposals of the artists that are submitted. Those proposals are considered democratically by a board to then be accepted and groomed and made more specific in some cases, and then rendered and executed as almost like experiments in social space, and then contextualized as an exhibition framed by a curator and written about through a press release. And it's in the press release you see things like the artist wanted to leave their studio.
Right.
The artist wanted to go into social space. The artist wanted to use social consciousness as a medium.
Or a mental hospital.
Or a mental hospital.
Right.
So it's deferring the responsibility of how and when this emerges onto now the artist in an official document that's delivered to the public. So it makes it sound like this was an emergent, burning desire of the creative community that we are merely shepherds to.
It's almost as funny as that wonderful Henry Ford quote when he says, we'll produce the Model T and everyone can choose the color as long as it's black. No, he actually said that. It's good. Yeah. It's not that different.
Great.
But tell me, how I've seen you be very critical of this art. At some point, when do you start? When Is this Bruce Lee, for example? Is this an example of what you call social engineering?
It's not art.
Okay.
There's a thing we engage as we are as with the Enlightenment period and how advanced we've become as humans. We see ourselves as pretty arrogantly more advanced than like superstitious rituals, practices of magical thinking, all this stuff. But there is something that is we do continue to do on a daily basis, and we deal with superstitious language and spells. So this pick a side mentality, calling this anti-Semitic. These are spells. These are ways to shut the conversation down, and when you call this art, you are intentionally misnaming it, I think. You are a lot like it's in that way that we call all that data gathering stuff online when you go on a website. Do you accept cookies? Who doesn't like cookies? I like cookies. What's wrong with cookies? Well, it's nefarious data gathering, and so, but calling it cookies, that sounds cute. Calling it art actually relaxes your mind in the intentions of what it is and how it functions, and we're really looking at something else. It's a Trojan horse. Calling it art makes you let it in the front door.
And also at the same time, you have other artists who did not answer the open call, who are maybe languishing because times are bad in Serbia. Serbia was blockaded under sanctions. There were civil wars that Serbia was involved with to a lesser or bigger extent, and that probably. How does that feel? How does that make artists feel? Who say, who are sitting and saying, this isn't art, but this guy's doing much better than I am.
Well, I'm the one saying that this isn't art. No one's saying that. You know, this is me trying to weaponize the language to help, because it's very destabilizing to say this isn't art. If I'm coming as an expert from my community and saying, actually, this isn't art, and by you calling it art, you're playing a game with society.
Yes, but isn't it depressing to think that no one else in Bosnia has said this isn't art?
Well,
someone must have, you can't be the only person who said to themselves, you can't be the only person with understanding of the field who thought this isn't art.
Right now, I'm the only person saying this. But what I will say is
Openly.
that the network, it's not like it offered a bunch of money in people's pockets. In comparison to what the artists unions were offering and like maybe the stability of like you have a studio, you have a guaranteed eventual moment of exhibition within culture that might lead to commissions. And, you know, and I'm not trying to paint the artist union system as like a free society or something, but it did offer some comforts of stability to artistic practice, despite it being about also control of messaging. And so what happened when the Soros Network comes in with this enormous amount of philanthropy, it's not that they're just lining artists' pockets. You got no money, you got no fees, you got maybe the opportunity to travel, and there would be some funding and pocket money maybe related to that. You got asymmetrically amazing production budgets, but that's not paying you. You're literally you're used as a beta tester for technological innovations and these experiments in social engineering, but it's not like it guarantees you any return of revenue. And this is the precarity of the avant-garde. Artists are always exploited and put on the front lines to be test bunnies for political ideology or technology, for example. All tech companies approach artists first to experiment with their new shit, with their new stuff, because artists are they're like bug chasers, or like they can. Artists have this incredible, intuitive, innovative ability to create systems and do bricolage interface. So a lot of early internet and early new media, they gave all that stuff to artists to mess with first, because the artists would come up with a framework for how we could better practically use these things. But they did it in the guise of, you know, their practice. And this happens all the time. VR technology, NFTs, all of it is funneled first through artists, and that becomes like a troubleshooting process that allows the bettering of the technology, and then the artist is kind of left behind as this person who played with a fad.
What is Soros realism, and how does it compare to the socialist realism?
Well, Soros realism is a term that comes from a Serbian academic named Miško Savakovic, and Miško rightly identified early, and it was actually in the late years. The network's already kind of dissipated. It's in 2002, 2001. He writes this text which names it Soros realism, where you have. Let's think about it mathematically, a conceptual arithmetic of A plus B equals C. And, the equation that Miško came up with Soros realism was that the artist would engage in traditional or referential identity politics within their respective condition. And these would often be pro-EU, like I, as a Bulgarian, want to see myself aspirationally in the EU, or what are what are topics that we can kind of fetishize, exoticize about this? Now it's a self-othering, so that's A is the identity, B is new media technology, so how do we internationalize it through technology, and C is Soros realist product. And so you have these very new kinds of identitarian art that are pro-EU or self-othering in a particular way. You don't have anything that is going outside of that in funny ways, like arguments, and the main argument today where Soros realism hits a very strange wall in its identitarian politics is whiteness. There's no space of understanding culturally what we mean by we're really freely discussing and proliferating identity politics around all kinds of underrepresented communities. But the moment you bring up whiteness, that's evil, right wing, white supremacist. Well, there's a real need to actually address all identity politics. Let's just be scientific, not stupidly political about all of this. Let's imagine that white Hungarians don't fall neatly into this white colonial narrative that's coming from the West. You know, they actually existed under colonial rule of other white groups. So is now a white Hungarian person supposed to see themselves as a colonizer? How's that work?
Well, you explained that to me because I saw you call your research decolonization.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, decolonization is what we do right now. That's what this whole process of what comes out of the network is beta testing language around decolonization. How do you decolonize society from the previous regime, which is the desovietization process or what have you, and the denationalization process, and how do you use art to holistically cure society from...
But presumably that's what Soros Centers were saying. We're de-Sovietizing you,
yeah,
right?
That's right, that's right.
Okay.
But what happens when Soviet thing is gone? What are you going to keep talking about that like as a boogeyman that we're going to decolonize continually? No, it's gone. You won. This has been a winning formula for decolonizing these previous things. But now the real problem is the decolonization has turned inward and it's become cannibalistic. You're seeing the NGOs and museums all over the world, they're cannibalizing each other through decolonization. Taking down every board member because they're a rich white person. Well, duh, they were always a rich white person. They always supported nefarious corporate interests. They always were nefarious, where we just it's like, so the whole decolonization philosophy is very much born in this think tank environment of the early 90s in Eastern Europe, and then it becomes academicized because you're looking at I always stress these years, 93, 95, well, what else happens there? In 1993, you see the birth of curatorial practice as a profession, as a professionalized academic opportunity. You see the birth of BARD, curating school, the Royal College of Art, Magasin in France, and this is a very new phenomenon. And all these curators from Eastern Europe, from the network, are actually brought in for education purposes, to bring advanced ideas about decolonization and post-colonial theory as an applied methodology.
When you talk about the moment that the Soros Centers shut down and leave, you say, well, the problem with the open society is that it needs a closed society. in order to, but is that the reason they left? Or did they consider their jobs done? So de-Sovietization had happened.
The way that the Open Society and the Soros Network saw themselves, they used this word, anti-political. They were an anti-political institution in the framework of culture. And they saw as political the Soviet left, the specter of this ghost that might return, and the nationalist right. And they were like the Freemason who knows the hands of good and evil and are going to show the path.
Mm-hmm.
And so and then we see the effect that it has on these art worlds. This, there is this bifurcation process of the art worlds are split, where there was this incredibly powerful new Western friendly neoliberal art world that emerged that gave a lot of people a lot of power, that made a lot of changes in the system. And then there were the people that were excluded from that were maybe, from a majority art world, actually, from the artists union or what more appealing to national cultural interests. And now that's what a lot of these art worlds are. They are like these two sides of sorts. And this art world is almost this Soros art world is kind of, I believe, seen like an obsolescing technology, like a product that's not taking off anymore. Because this decolonization narrative and the way you see it manifested in the institutions that are clearly the baton pass ideologically of what the Soros Centers represented, they're very clearly, spaces for neoliberal propaganda. They're using art as a messaging system for neoliberal propaganda interests. And why this is interesting, why this story is so interesting, as like we look at emergent behavior phenomena and science, try to look at it. There is no real, there's no one doing good anthropology about the art world. And so you have to revert to like pseudoscience and science, hopeful scientific method to reveal these results, because also humans don't like to be boxed into behavior patterns so easily, even though we are always. And so what's happening now, which is fascinating across these regions, where these were the most advanced socially engaged practices and carrying the flag of neoliberal futures and pro-EU friendly stuff, these are becoming some of the most right-wing places in Europe. Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovenia, places that George Soros very easily wrote off as cured.
Exactly. So he didn't leave a string of open societies behind his centers.
The thing about the neoliberal experiment is that you had a lot of opportunism. Like people, all kinds of people were willing to do the Macarena to get a piece of the action. And so you did have a lot of right-wing or, oligarchical people come in and, take control of industries, the privatization opportunities that were offered in that, breakdown and decentralization process. And now those people kind of are holding a lot of the cards today. And, a lot of them turned out to be right-wing. And yet they played the song the right way at the time to feel like they were the right innovative neo-capitalists.
Well, you also say at some point that these centers were full of very well-intentioned people.
Yes.
That it was not their plan to leave what you call non-art behind them, or to let right-wing organizations take over after them. But nothing follows from that. I mean, it doesn't. In another field, in journalism, a similar thing to some extent happened, that George Soros, early on, his organization said, we don't want to help any journalists that in Serbia, in Yugoslavia, that have to do with the government, the Milosevic regime. So if you want money from us, you'll have to split and have a separate organization and a separate bank account, and we can help you. And that came to be, and it caused a rift within the journalism community, because we had a major journalist organization here, one of the oldest in Europe. But that rift has not healed. Soros has reduced its funding of media, but the unions, the journalist unions, are still polarized, and it's not even a smaller division that it used to be. And I find that much as the Western governments liked working with the new Soros-funded Journalists Association, and found it then easy to use it also politically, well, the government now has an easier hand. It's got two organizations. These two organizations are powerful in their own way, but they're not as powerful and as difficult to deal with as one major organization would have been. I'm not saying that Soros ever intended this, but this is one of the consequences of dividing unions, associations, professions, societies. Has something similar happened in art?
Something incredible is happening right now, and it's scary. It's actually so scary people don't want to talk about it, and they do everything to hide it. But there's a right-wing takeover happening in cultural institutions in these countries where this story matters the most. And what's happening through that, which is really, I think, the most fascinating arc of my narrative, is that if you imagine that the most advanced socially engaged practice is coming out of this NGO influence in Eastern Europe, well, then one day Frankenstein's monster comes home in the form of right-wing socially engaged practice. And it's freaking people out. No one's willing to talk about it because the simple reaction to it is that's propaganda. What the right wing are doing right now, that is, they're using our institutions to deliver right-wing propaganda, art and ideas in the interest of the right wing. Well, the real hilarity and the problem, the moment you say that's propaganda, is, well, that's propaganda too. It's all propaganda. The art world is a monopoly of ideology, and suddenly when an other emerges, it actually allows the mirror to be revealed. And the art world has to look at itself now in the mirror and see that, oh yeah, we're propaganda too. We're basically weaponizing artist practices for very specific corporate neoliberal interests.
So in the end, this wasn't just an Eastern European thing. I mean, it's now planetary.
It's a virus. It's a literal virus. The funny thing is, this story is hurtful. It's a hurtful story because it's arguing that people's activism is not their own, that they've been astroturfed by their industry.
Explain the concept of astroturf.
Well, astroturfing is an amazing concept. It's we have this idea of grassroots movements, grassroots activist movements. You know, it's like, I am from my community, and we together are going to come up against a power structure or make a change. You know, that's authentic grassroots activism. And then there's this word, astroturfing, which comes from football, sports stadiums. They lay down this plastic grass. It's fake grassroots movements. So it's grassroots movements like BLM, which is a real movement, but it has received a lot of funding from places it's not extremely transparent about. And it's weaponizing grassroots movements in the interest of corporate political agendas that maybe that aren't native to the grassroots movement itself. And so that is like almost like a conspiracy theory. People want to argue this doesn't happen. It literally happens all the time. The interesting thing about it happening in the art world, it's through a couple of structures. One is these open call systems. They're not open calls. They are closed calls for how you funnel your practice into a political desire. Then there's the industry, not willing to give you a voice if you're not singing the right song.
But I have to ask you, when you talk about the Frankenstein monster and the right wing, are you? Viktor Orban is not an artist, but he was someone who was funded by Soros in education and politics. Are you in any oblique way referring to people like him? When you talk about the return of the Frankenstein monster.
But look, Viktor Orban is an artist. If you've ever been to Budapest and seen the House of Terror.
No, I've been to Budapest, but not seen the House of Terror.
This is an art installation. in the form of memory politics. They're using the language of contemporary artists, and it's set design for political propaganda. And that's the fascinating thing that you can see now in contemporary art, is that artists' objects, like I'm an artist, I make an object. My object is now infused with political ideology, and the object is a rhetorical device. It's a stand-in for a political belief. And you acknowledge as an appreciator of art the object, and therefore you accept the politics. And so the art, it's a kind of a Trojan horse.
Does it work?
It absolutely works, and it's a Trojan horse for political messaging. And you're seeing that across the board now, that people are investing political ideology into the message that their artwork has, and we are accepting that those political messages are the right ones, right? Until you see the wrong ones. Right, and that's inflammatory as hell. You know, actually seeing socially engaged practice from the right wing is terrifying to echo my industry's fears. But literally, scientifically, anthropologically, it's fascinating.
But do you think it's part of Orban's political success as well? I mean, when you said he's an artist, did you mean he's a political artist, or he's very good at exploiting art for his political purposes?
Well, something I don't think I said before when we talk about this right-wing takeover is that the right wing, art institutions historically have been given a free pass in culture of they're doing the right thing, they're doing their due diligence to help understand this shamanic energy that is called culture that we're producing all the time, and how do we tell those stories that need to be told, and understand these very special innovations of the human project. And now art museums are weirdly history museums. Like, we don't have history museums anymore. You don't have this, it's unsafe to have a clear historical narrative. Those are playing out. Those historical narratives are playing out through our art museums. And so there is something that the art museums were always given a free pass, even though they're edgy towards conservative traditionalist values, like they're going to always come up against the church, they're going to always come up against political issues. Actually, they're going to make the right wing uncomfortable, and the right wing have finally woken up and realized we can do this too. Let's like flush all our municipal institutions like a toilet and install right wing people at the tops of these things now, because we got some stories to tell.
Well, you know, again, as a journalist, to me, this sounds very much like Fox News becoming the most watched game in town. I remember that era. And now it's CNN and the others are very much the same, appealing to emotions, fueling indignation. That's what they do all day long.
Yeah.
On CNN, is that this same process the other way around, where now everyone seems like Fox, except with different politics?
No, I spent a bunch of time with these right-wing people. You know, we didn't talk about how I embedded myself in the right wing to make this project happen in a very dangerous place, to make people look at it and to force their hand. Even though I'm not a right-wing person, my project is not a right-wing project, I knew it could be weaponized. I always knew it could be weaponized. But I thought, well, if no one's allowing me to tell this story, I'm going to weaponize it and to get the story out there. And I spent a load of time with these new right-wing people, and because I needed to do my due diligence as a good curator. If I'm going to bring my artists into harm's way, I need to know what these people are like. The moment I had any interest from them, I was like, I want you to fly me out there right away. I want to have dinner with you. I want to shake hands with the devil, because I'm told you're the devil by the New York Times. And I want to understand, what are you doing with art that everyone is so scared of that they can't even talk about it, that they're just immediately like, oh, it's all homophobic and anti-Semitic. Well, I was like, why are they saying that? What's homophobic and what's anti-Semitic? And they're like, you know, we have this work that's like, it's not pro-LGBT, but it's offering us like a sort of resistance, but it's not anti-LGBT either. But that's enough to be homophobic, transphobic. I couldn't find anything that defined the anti-Semitic qualities of what they're doing. But for whatever reason, the New York Times and all these magazines are allowed to legitimize that as a feeling, and without doing any due diligence or proving it. And so then you go and you see this program that we're not allowed to look at. No one's allowed to look at it. And when you tell me that, when you tell me I can't look at
You want to
something,
go look at
I'm
it.
gonna go. Like, that is magnetism for me. I'm like, you're gonna give all this shit, this negative energy, and not try to understand it? That's bad. That's like bad energy work, man. You know, you're gonna go and hide that stuff under the rug. One day that's gonna come back and haunt you if you don't be careful. And that's what's happening. And so what happens is it's not just that the right wing's like doing anti-neoliberal or anti-liberal or liberal values or progressive values. There, I saw things that fit a very particular narrative that I was reading about how, for example, in Poland, they're trying to holistically heal their name and their reputation in relationship to World War II as accomplices of the Nazis. Um, the show that opened days before mine in the museum was called The First Transport. And it literally looked like a show that could have been designed by Ai Weiwei, the famous Chinese artist. It was using all the principles of Ai Weiwei's work to create a political statement. And this is a conceptual arithmetic, right? And do it like the Macarena. And so in this show, they're arguing that the first transport of people, and this is a historical fact, the first transport of people to Auschwitz were Polish Catholics. And that's a reminder to say we were the first victims, right? And then the thing that I saw that blew my mind, when we think about how museums represent frames, pedagogical, didactic frames for transmitting information, there is this zone that we call the exhibition space where all the crazy ideas are happening. And then there's this neutral zone called the text panel where like you're not in that zone, but this is how you understand that zone. And these are two different zones of like ideologically how they function for the experience of the viewer. These are not the same zone. The artist did a thing on the text panel where the word was written blah, 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 Nazis. And in big red pen, like a Duchamp gesture, he crossed out Nazis and wrote Germans. So he's trying to do a thing of like, let's stop using this word Nazis, which is an amorphous idea of an evil group of people that don't exist anymore, might exist in the shadows. But like it's an abstract word, Nazis, that gives people a very abstract boogeyman that they can rely on. Those were Germans. It was a German political party, no different than MAGA or something. And so to call it Nazis abstracts it into this nefarious boogeyman realm that humans could become evil Nazis again or something like that. And the problem with the word Nazi in the Eastern European context is that so many groups from Latvia to Poland are given this automatic relationship to the word when, let's be honest, it was a German group. And so I read about that before my trip to Poland. I read about this thing that's happening that they're trying to revise the language. And then I saw it in action in an exhibition context in the didactic text panel. I saw the application of a tactical media idea that will work to fit an agenda that I was told about. And I was blown away. That was the biggest part of that show, was seeing how this guy vandalized his own text panel, vandalized the sanctity of this information transfer for political action.
Talking about using the tricks of art, contemporary art, for political purposes, I've seen you make a reference to Srđa Popovic's book, Pranksters and Autocrats, in which he describes how you can do things that will make an autocrat overreact and then destabilize the system that he is trying to preserve. How does that fit into this story of art?
I think it fits perfectly as a funny language game that is being played. So something I did in my research is I have gone to great lengths to understand this idea of tactical media, not just as a philosophy, but
tactical media.
Tactical media is an emergent philosophy that comes from the network and adjacent to the network. In 92 to 94, it's named tactical media in '94, but it's coming from people from within the network and that are lubricated by the network financially for these talks and stuff. And tactical media is not art. Tactical media is the weaponization of perception, and it's tricks that are there all the time for us. If you understand the rules of the game, that you can do a little thing and call it art, and it's going to do something by you calling it that'll allow it in the front door. And so a classic example of tactical media, that because we rely on artists to be these pranksters, to be these subversionaries that are going to break language for us and show us the innovative potential of the human project. And so a classic tactical media game is Duchamp's Urinal, the ready-made. That is a fork in the road in how we understand objects and cultural language and the magical potential of the artist to be like, that's art because I say so, because I say so. And that's shamanism, that's literal shamanism on some level. And it's definite magical thinking. And so tactical media is this like little magical rabbit that artists can pull out of the hat, but it starts to become formalized as a language in the 90s as tactical media. And when we look at like that Polyphony project or some of my case study exhibitions from the network, you see that these are experiments in tactical media, hands down. This is not art.
Not art.
And so why does that become interesting for a narrative like Srdja Popovic? Because I look at his book like a history of performance art. And that's how he wants you to look at it, actually. But he's also suggesting that if done well enough, you can bring down regimes with a little gesture like that. And that's some seriously magical shit that we have to acknowledge. But it's very savvy understandings of human behavioral patterns and how he's setting up these dilemma actions is what he calls them. Dilemma actions that will force the dictator, whoever, into a lose-lose battle, where no matter what choice he makes, they're going to lose, and they will lose power, they will lose reputation, or they'll be humiliated, et cetera, et cetera. And so these actions that he's promoting, I believe, originate in a very think tank-like way, experiments in social space, et cetera, through the network. And maybe he's going to claim that he came up with this on his own. Good luck to him with that.
We have to wrap it up, but I want to ask you, what would you now say, what would be your advice to a young artist, anywhere, but in Serbia, for example?
Thank you for asking me that. That's like really my gift, I think. I don't like that I'm going to be defined by this story. I'm an incredible mediator and a messenger, and I believe I can help artists and creativity and the path of this industry in a way that's important for what we need in our human project. Because I would say that we are spiritually bankrupt as a society, and we are looking to politics to nourish a spiritual instinct, and it's poisoning us. It's creating toxic behavior patterns of political religions and so forth, and it's not returning to us anything that we actually desire, which is transcendental aspirations. And art is a vehicle for spirituality. I don't care which spirituality. I'm not advocating any spiritual dogma, but there is a human impulse, and as it relates to energy and manifesting and materializing energy, that is pre-political if you let it be. And I think that we're missing an opportunity with this game of calling it art. I use that for magic. I'm like, I'm going to make this safe for you now. I want you to call it art, even though it's hardcore witchcraft or shamanism or whatever. By calling it art, this is what I learned from the network, you're going to let it in the front door. And so I think there's a lot of ideas of tactical media that if we acknowledge them like rules of the game, we'll advance, actually. The artist's potential is and always will be as an innovator and capable of revealing to us anomalies. And that's actually something that when we have this fear of artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence actually can be creative in a way that's terrifying, but only the human can make errors and have those errors become anomalies that turn into new ideas and so what is my advice to an artist? Don't go to grad school. That's a Ponzi. That is a waste of money unless it's important for you to be in a new cultural community and if you're going to exploit that energy as best you can. That's the only reason you go to grad school anymore. Otherwise, you're inviting yourself into a Ponzi of disappointment. And really, I'm not saying you shouldn't be political, but you should acknowledge if your politics are your own, and if you know, the big problem of the art world and its political narratives is that it's preaching to the choir all the time. I don't need that. I don't like. We all agree that these things are bad. Like, why are you showing it again and again and again? Why can't we? Why can't we move on? I think that, you know, we're seeing everyone's trauma is being exploited as a key facet of their identity. So artists are forced into exploiting their own trauma, inventing their own trauma, and I'd say avoid that. You know what the best advice that you would get from a shaman is? Real true advice that will actually help heal the world. Let it go. Do not carry these things and let them define you. That's a system that's exploiting you, that's making you do that. And so I advocate for all kinds of, you know, applying shamanic and magical thinking practices to create new opportunities, anomalies, and ideas of art as a vehicle for spirituality. I think we can find new language that's actually going to help answer the real questions of where we came from and where we're going, stuff that science is never going to be able to do. We're going to be able to tell those stories always in interesting ways through art.
Thank you, Aaron Moulton, for this conversation and for coming to Belgrade.
Thank you so much.
I hvala I vama što ste bili sa nama.